Sweden has, for the most part, refused to follow the madness of the rest of the Western world in bringing in extreme long-term lockdowns and draconian restrictions such as social distancing and masks. And anti-lockdowners such as myself have long argued that Sweden's death figures show that COVID-19 wasn't anywhere near as dangerous as the lockdown fanatics were making out. This view of Sweden has been shouted down by an avalanche of trolls and midwit newspaper columnists who've howled, "But Sweden is a disaster area," and "What about Norway?" The trolls' angry denunciations have led people to believe that Sweden is a killing field, with mass deaths caused by their murderously reckless scientists. Even 6 months ago, an objective look at Sweden's figures showed this take to be arrant nonsense. Their all-cause death numbers over spring 2020, the worst months for COVID, were completely normal by the country's historical standards. Nowhere near even being the worst months in the last few decades for Sweden, let alone in the last 100. Here, for example, is a graph of Swedish death rates in the periods January to April for 1990 to 2020. So you've got 1990 on the left and 2020 on the right. If you look from left to right, you can see that in this January to April period, numbers have been a little bit up and down over that 30 years, and declining slightly over time. 2020, we can see, was completely normal when compared to the same January to April period in all those other years. No disaster there at all. But you may say, what about April, the worst month of that period in 2020? Well, here's a graph of the worst months for deaths in Sweden since 1990. Where is April 2020? It's on the far right-hand edge. So April 2020, supposedly the worst month for the world in a century outside war times, in fact had lower deaths than 20 other months in Sweden in just the last 30 years, let alone a century. The worst month in that time was in fact March 1993. Where is the Holocaust? Where is the enormous spike we should have expected to see in April 2020, towering above the other months like a modern skyscraper dwarfing a corner shop? It's not there. Because there was no Holocaust in Sweden, not even in April. April 2020 was just a regular month. Yes, it will have had a few more deaths than Swedish Aprils normally have, but nothing like the historical catastrophe we were told was going to happen. Most governments, scientists and media outlets have inexcusably ignored these facts for over half a year, and when forced to say something about Sweden, they have continued to just parrot the lazy assumption that Sweden is a charnel house. It just isn't. This is a total, blatant lie. Now, 10 months on since the Western world went mad, the overall figures for Sweden's all-cause mortality for 2020 are available. And it's time we had a proper look at these figures, and stop taking this lunatic mania for lockdown seriously. So here's a graph of the annual all-cause death rates for Sweden, going all the way back to 1851. This graph was produced by Johan Hellstrom using data from Statistics Sweden, the official Swedish government statistics agency. Take a good look at this. You've got 1851 on the left, and as we sweep right we come into the 20th century, and then finally into the 21st. The column for 2020 is on the far right in red. You can see that not only was there no horror movie in Sweden in 2020, there wasn't much of anything in Sweden in 2020. There were a few more deaths than in the last 5 to 6 years, but 2020 was in fact one of the least grim years for mortality that Sweden has ever seen. Far from being a once-in-a-century disaster, 2020 saw less deaths than 2012. And less deaths than over 90% of the previous 168 years. Far less, in most of these cases. If you jumbled up all these years and then asked one of the doomsayers to pick out the Holocaust that is 2020 in Sweden, they wouldn't have a hope in hell of being able to do so. Because not only was there not a Holocaust in Sweden in 2020, there wasn't much of anything in Sweden in 2020. 2020 was supposed to be the year the world faced the worst killer disease for a century. Yet if you do go back a century to 1919 on this graph, you can see a spike sticking out of the data above all the other years. That was a bad year, especially seeing as many of the lives lost in that year to the Spanish flu were those of young people, which is most definitely not the case with COVID. Is 2020 anything like 1919? No, not remotely. We've seen a multitude of graphs on all sorts of COVID and lockdown related matters over the last 10 months. But this is the one graph that kills the case for lockdowns and all the other restrictions stone dead. Sweden's government did not enforce social distancing, it did not enforce mask wearing, it did not lock people up in their own homes, all the things that most other governments insisted were totally necessary to avoid mass death, and which had to be enforced with massive fines. Yes, Sweden had a few restrictions, such as closing high schools at various points, which we know makes very little difference to COVID spread, and they added a few more in 2021. But generally Sweden has been free of lockdowns, restrictions and masks. Yet far from seeing any sort of disaster, Sweden saw only slightly elevated death levels compared to recent years, and a death rate less than almost every year in their history before 2012. This tells us that COVID is about as dangerous as a very bad flu, and, like flu, it's finishing off mostly very elderly people already near death. But it's no more than that. And no one in their right mind thinks we should shut the world down indefinitely for a bad flu. Here's a close-up of this graph looking at the most recent few years. What you can see on this close-up is the fact that Sweden had an exceptionally low death rate in the year 2019. 2019 was in fact easily the lowest year in Sweden's recorded history, and this was after a number of years of lower rates. Although some of this is perhaps due to immigration bringing younger people into the population, it is likely that Sweden was building up a number of very elderly people who were near the end of their life and who would be vulnerable to a nasty flu-type virus. It is very rare for any country to have continual decline in their annual death rate for more than a decade. Usually the numbers go back upwards again for a few years, as those people eventually die. Anyway, the contrast between 2019 and 20 is nothing unusual. Sweden has had similar pairs of years in its past, with similar jumps in numbers from one year to the next. And when we average 2019 and 20 together, we end up with a death rate for that 2-year period that is completely in line with the recent average. Let's now take a closer look at some of the hysterical claims being made by the doomsayers in spring 2020. Here's a graph from a paper called COVID-19 Healthcare Demand and Mortality in Sweden in Response to Non-Pharmaceutical Mitigation and Suppression Scenarios. Preprint for this paper came out on medRxiv in spring 2020 and was influential in pro-lockdown circles, with dire warnings about ICUs in Sweden being swamped many times over. And the paper was eventually published in the International Journal of Epidemiology, which is shocking, as it's an appallingly bad paper in many ways, not least with the improperly labelled graphs in it. The particular graph you can see here shows the predictions made by their model for the scenario that most closely resembled what actually happened in Sweden in regards to restrictions and voluntary social distancing. It predicts about 45,000 COVID deaths in Sweden by the end of March. In actual fact, the number of deaths by that stage was 332. So that forecast was hopelessly wrong. Another influential paper, the preprint of which also came out on medRxiv, was called Intervention Strategies Against COVID-19 and Their Estimated Impact on Swedish Healthcare Capacity, and that was written by some academics from Uppsala University. This paper apparently made use of the same computer model that Neil Ferguson used. It predicted even more COVID deaths for Sweden than the previous paper. So they predicted that with the relaxed approach Sweden took, with few restrictions, there would be 96,000 COVID deaths in Sweden by July 1st, 2020, possibly even up to 183,000, with 52,000 the absolute minimum. And here's their predictions expressed in the form of some graphs. There's two scenarios presented here. The left-hand graph, A, is for the scenario where there's a doubling of deaths every 3 days in the early stages, and the right-hand graph, B, is for a doubling every 5 days. These are the two doubling scenarios that they thought were the most likely to obtain in reality. The blue line in both graphs represents the situation where the minimal government interventions that were current at that time remained in place. And looking at the blue lines, we can see that their model predicted at least 80,000 deaths by around the 3rd week of May 2020, and over 90,000 by that time if the doubling time was 3 days rather than 5. As we know, nothing remotely like this happened. In actual fact, by that time Sweden had a little over 4,000 COVID deaths, not 80,000, not 96,000. I said the prediction in the last paper was hopelessly wrong, but this one is fantastically, galactically wrong. Next time you hear someone saying that Sweden's official epidemiologists were wrong to ignore the scientific doomsayers, remind them that these were the sort of scientists who the lockdowners were telling us had got it right, and Anders Tegnell got it wrong. In reality, these people were about as clownish as you could possibly be without putting on a red nose and clown clothes and makeup and the squirting flour and carrying a honking horn around with you. Have these sorts of fools apologised for their epic wrongness? Have they apologised to Anders Tegnell? Like hell they have. They've continued to try to make out that he's the crazy one, who still needs to change course and come around to their point of view. Remember that religious lunatics never apologise. Oh, and here's another one from the extremely influential and prestigious Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the IMHE. Here's what they were saying about Sweden back in early September when I took a screenshot from their COVID-19 health data page. The red dashes represent the deaths predicted by their model in the hypothetical scenario where the Swedish government removed the already modest restrictions that were current at the time. And the purple line represents deaths if the current restrictions were kept, and the green line down the bottom is if masks are worn. So their models were saying there'd be over 700 COVID deaths a day if the Swedish government eased off, which equates to 21,000 deaths if that stayed like that for a month. It also says there'd be about 200 deaths a day if things were kept the same, and only about 20 a day if the Swedish government introduced masks. In other words, there would be about a 680 deaths a day difference between the scenario where the few restrictions already in place were eased, and the scenario where they weren't eased and masks were worn. Even at the time, this was clearly a ludicrous projection. There's no evidence from the many mask-wearing countries that masks have made any difference to anything, and the idea that Sweden would have over 700 deaths a day if the few restrictions they already had were lifted or merely eased bears no relation to reality. If we look at the IMHG page for Sweden now, their figures tell us that Sweden's COVID deaths after that period built up to a high of around 90 for a few weeks, and is now dropping off again. The IMHG is still pushing masks, as you can see from the dashed green line heading down towards the bottom of the graph, compared to the two maskless scenarios, which are much higher up in the number range. But this time we're only talking 60 to 90 deaths a day difference, not 680. Have they said anything about how they got things wrong, and about how they've quietly revised their estimates downwards? And not that I'm aware of. The IMHG is an extremely prestigious organisation, and their predictions have been used by scientists and governments to justify harsh lockdowns. Yet their COVID predictions for many countries, not just Sweden, have consistently been a joke. But when have you heard the legacy media or the scientific community blasting them and saying they have no credibility? You don't, because the IMHE is on the right side of the current narrative, so they are immune to any sort of serious criticism. This is not science, this is religion. Let's now look at a different objection that lockdown fanatics make against the Swedish argument. Some doomsayers have taken a completely different line on Sweden. They agree with me that Sweden's death numbers are nothing remotely like a disaster, but they claim that this is because the Swedes did have a lockdown, only an unofficial one. The Swedes, they say, avoided all the deaths that were supposed to happen because they did do the same thing that Britain and all the other lockdown countries did. It's just that their government didn't require it. But the Swedish people, being good, obedient, responsible citizens, did those things anyway. They shut everything down, they social distanced, they stayed home and so on, just like other countries. This isn't true though. First of all, we can compare Google's mobility data between the two countries to see that while there was some amount of this happening in Sweden, it was not happening to anything like the same extent as in Britain, especially during the worst spring months. Here are some charts I've made based on Google's mobile phone tracking data, taken from Our World in Data. It's not perfect data by any means, but the differences between the countries are stark enough to draw some conclusions. This first chart looks at grocery and pharmacy shopping. Sweden is blue, the UK is brown. You can see that Sweden was pretty much normal throughout 2020, whereas the Brits really did go to the shop a lot less, especially in spring. Here's a graph of visits to transit stations. You can see that the Swedes did travel less in 2020, that is true, but nowhere near to the extent that the British travelled less. In spring, British travel via transit stations, by which they mean things like train and bus stations, was down by over 70% of normal at the lowest point, and anyone who travelled in Britain in 2020 could see for themselves just how scarily empty the trains and the train stations were. Normally packed stations like King's Cross and St Pancras were like ghost stations. Here's workplace visits. Again, Sweden dipped a bit, but nowhere near as much as Britain did in the spring months. A lot of Swedes took midsummer off, but in autumn they were still mostly back at their desks, more so than the UK. And here's retail and recreation. Vast differences between the countries, especially over spring. Sweden was mostly normal in that period, whereas Britain was in hiding. Yet as we saw, Sweden's death numbers were nothing out of the ordinary for that period. Further evidence that there was no de facto lockdown comes from the numerous videos posted by Swedish people, showing normal life going on in Swedish cities, with no social distancing and no masks, as well as documentary footage made by people such as Sean Collins and Simon Dolan, who visited Sweden with a film crew. You're currently watching some footage of Stockholm in September 2020, which was posted on social media. And now let's speed it up. It goes on for ages like this. Note also that voluntary mask wearing has not taken off in Sweden at all. A few people do it, but not many, whereas in Britain one can see whole streets of people wearing masks. I should also point out that this entire line of attack is misguided anyway. If one accepts that Sweden has done fine without a government-mandated lockdown, and without many restrictions, then one has thereby accepted a large part of my position, which is that we don't need or want government-mandated restrictions. Even if it were true, I don't think it is, but even if it were true that most people in Sweden voluntarily restricted themselves, and this is what kept death numbers in the normal range, then that's no reason for supporting official lockdowns. On the contrary, it's an admission that government-mandated action is not required, and that voluntary action, by those who make individual judgments for themselves, is sufficient. Another excuse often trotted out by the lockdown fanatics is that Sweden is less urbanised and has less urban density than Britain. Again, this is not true. To quote from Trading Economics, the urban population, percentage of total population in Sweden, was reported at 87% in 2019, according to the World Bank collection of development indicators, compiled from officially recognised sources, while Britain's urban population in the United Kingdom was reported at 83% in the same year. As far as population density goes, according to World Population Review, Greater London has a density of 14,550 residents per square mile in the Greater London area, while Stockholm has 13,000 per square mile. Now, this issue does get more involved the more one looks into it, but overall it's just not true that there's any significant difference in urban density between the countries. This whole line of argument is ludicrous anyway. On the one hand, we're supposed to believe that COVID is the modern equivalent of the Black Death, which must be met with historically unprecedented restrictions of freedom, but also we're supposed to accept that it can be mostly defeated if your urban density is a bit more spread out than England's. What kind of a medieval plague is it that is stymied by a country's houses being possibly slightly further apart than another country's? That logic just doesn't add up, or to put it more bluntly, the whole thing's a crock of crap. Let's now look briefly at economic issues. Sweden's economy is in a good place. Its GDP was only down by -2.6% for the year, and that was all caused by the irrational actions of the countries it trades with, not itself. The UK's GDP, on the other hand, was down by -8.6% for the year, one of the biggest dips in its history, and more than 3 times Sweden's. Even this figure is misleading because it covers up the underlying damage currently being done to many of the UK's sectors, and we have to take into account the incredibly high volumes of money the UK government is still continuing to borrow every day. But this is not the place to go into detail about the economic issues. Suffice it to say that Sweden is doing okay economically, whereas Britain is not. Overall, the Swedish people had a normal year in 2020. Britain could have done so too had they seen sense and copied the Swedish approach. Unfortunately, pressure has been brought to bear upon the Swedish establishment from the rabid members of various international bodies and through false media depictions of the country, which has meant that Sweden, despite its success, has recently introduced some more restrictive measures, although generally the country remains relatively free of restrictions. For example, Dr. Sebastian Rushworth, a Swedish GP and lockdown skeptic, recently tweeted a picture of the rush hour trains in Stockholm and said, "Few masks. The claims of a Swedish lockdown are greatly exaggerated." Anyway, the fact that some Swedish politicians and royalty are starting to call for more restrictions in response to this pressure doesn't provide any sort of justification at all for lockdown, and the data shows that it is totally unnecessary. So how is Sweden currently doing then? It's doing fine. There was an increase in COVID deaths over December and January, but far from this resulting in explosive exponential growth and 96,000 deaths or something similarly far-fetched, we see that it soon plateaued and has now tailed off steadily to single digits. Sweden was a shining beacon of freedom and rationality in 2020, and it should stay that way, and we should join them, rather than them joining us in our miserable, pitiful and ruinous state.